Let's get ready to roll. All right, folks, let's settle in. We'll get started in just a minute. All good? Awesome. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our very first Climate Action and Advocacy Tour event here at Hartford. So thrilled to be here, and even more thrilled to have you here with us. I know you all have busy schedules and busy lives, so we really do appreciate you taking the time to be here. So, we will get into it with some introductions, since you should probably know who will be hosting the event this evening. And I'll go first. For those who don't know me, my name is Jordan Hayden. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm VPIRG's Keep Vermont Cool campaign manager. And if you're new to the campaign, we launched it back in March, and so far we have activated over 15,000 Vermonters into taking meaningful forms of climate action. So we're really proud of that. We're going to continue that work through virtual and in-person events, digital engagement opportunities, and VPIRG Summer Canvas. So that's a little bit about me and the work I'm doing with the campaign. We've got a table set there in the back. You're welcome to check that out later this evening. And we can certainly talk more about the campaign later, but that's not why we're here tonight. And so that's a little bit about me, and I'm so happy to be here, and it's so nice to meet you all. So now I will pass the baton over to Senator-elect Rebecca White.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, I'm Becca White, and I was recently elected to the Vermont State Senate, and I'm really excited that we're kicking this off here because this is my hometown in Hartford. I started out, welcome, take a seat. Perfect timing. We're just getting started. I started on the select board here in Hartford when I was 20, and I've been in public service since, so this feels like a really nice full circle moment for me. I have served on House Transportation while being in the legislature, so one of my core things around climate change is how we think about transportation as it relates to climate. So we're going to have a lot to share with you today, and we have some other legislators who are here as well. I can't go on introducing myself without mentioning that I serve in a team of 3. You also elected Senator Allison Clarkson for an additional term, and you also elected Senator Dick McCormick. So I know that, and Dick is here with us tonight. And we'll have a moment for further introductions by the legislators, and you'll have time to talk to them individually. But I do just want to call out that we have newly elected Representative Esme Cole. With our busy schedules, there's a competing meeting in Thetford. So Senator Allison Clarkson and and Representative Jim Maslin are both up there, hoping to make it down here, depending on the time of that meeting. And Representative Coach Christie is on a Zoom meeting, and as soon as he gets off, he's going to come downstairs.
Thank you. All right, so moving on to our agenda to give you a sense of what we've got going on this evening, we'll continue on with our welcome and introductions. As Senator-elect White mentioned, we have some legislators in the room, so you'll get to know them all a little bit better. We'll then break out into a small and brief climate card activity, and it's going to be lots of fun. You're going to love it. After that, I'll dig into some climate impacts that are happening here in the state and what you can do to get involved. And then I'll pass it back over to Senator-elect White, and she will cover an election overview and talk through our 2023 climate policy priorities. So lots of good stuff coming there. And then once you're sick of hearing us both talk, we'll break out into an advocacy group, probably multiple groups because we do have a pretty decent crowd in here tonight. And you'll get to learn more about your legislators, the work they're doing, what they've got coming up, experiences they may have, and that's where you'll get to learn what you can do to advocate for climate in the coming election and in the coming legislative session. So we'll wrap it all up with a Q&A. We'll talk about next steps, and we'll leave plenty of time for mixing and mingling with all the wonderful people in this room. So hopefully that all sounds good to you. We've got a very packed agenda, but we're super excited about it. And next, I will pass it over to Earl to give a land acknowledgement. And please, Earl, introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, I just popped a nut in my mouth. I knew I was going to do that. Thank you. I'm Earl Hetley. I'm an enrolled member of the Mrs. Coy Band of Abenaki Nation here in Vermont, or Abenaki if you say the French pronunciation, or Wabanaki as we say it in our language. So land acknowledgement is something that we have been doing in Indian country forever, long before 1492. Whenever we go somewhere to have a meeting, and we sit and we meet with each other, especially if we're on someone else's territory, we always start a meeting by acknowledging where we are. We start all of our meetings with land acknowledgement and prayer, because that's who we are as people. So this is our savage heathen way of starting things. And so land acknowledgement is about the land that we stand on, the people whose land that is, and giving respect for being there and being on that land with those peoples. And so we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Abenaki Nation. And we give thanks to their ancestors, their elders, and their people, both past and present, and future generations. And so we honor those peoples, and we thank them for being here and for having protected this land all of this time. And so we give thanks, and we also say that we too are here to protect this land for future generations, all of us together. And so this is our acknowledgement that this is our land, and we acknowledge that this is Abenaki land as well, and we are all here together. And so we acknowledge this land and pledge protection of this land for future generations. And so that's our land acknowledgement. It should always be from the heart, in the moment. Believing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. And now I will pass it back over to you, Senator
Okay.
White, to do some formal intros.
So, we have a brief intro we did for saying hello to our elected leaders, but I did want to highlight some of the work that has been done by each of the folks who are on this screen. So I want to start first with Senator Dick McCormick because he's here. If you don't know Senator McCormick, you should know that he has been involved with the response to climate change before we really understood that we were responding to climate change. So I'd let you take it from there if there's anything specific you want to highlight or say, but you were the Climate Solutions Caucus co-chair before. You were the first.
No,
No?
no, I think actually Chris Pearson was, and then I replaced him, and then he replaced
Oh, there you go.
him. Yeah. Forgive me for not getting up, I'm having a little arthritis issues this evening, so, as you all will eventually. Some do already. Sure. I have often said that, how much do you want me to talk?
Just say
I
it.
could talk for an hour.
Oh, how we could save that for the break.
No, that, 30 years ago, talking about this issue, actually 40, I remember when President Jimmy Carter said, we can get started now. It was 1979. We can get started now, and we can move incrementally and rather painlessly, and we can get off of fossil fuels. Or we can wait, and we can have, in 30 years, we'll have an emergency. Well, we waited 40 years, and we do have an emergency. 40 years ago, people who spoke about climate change, global warming, we spoke in the future tense. This is going to happen. If we don't stop, this will happen, that'll happen. this is now, we're here. And I'll say to some of the younger people, what it's like to be an old person is that time moves on, your body ages, but your internal sense of yourself is constant. So you shift in time. I feel, and I think other old people would say this as well, I feel very much that I am not living in the present. I'm living in the future. This is the future to me, and now we're here. And I've got to say, it's worse than we predicted. If there are changes, it is that at least people are giving lip service to the issue. And that implies that we have an agreement, at least in theory, that we're going to do something. The other thing is that the real flat-out science deniers have pretty much dealt themselves out of the discussion. But what we have now are the minimizers. The minimizers are saying, well, yeah, it's a problem, but what we ought to do is move incrementally and painlessly. And I'm saying, no, you're living in the past. You think it's 1979, but it's not. So that's that's my overarching 40,000 foot view.
Well said. Thank you. Well said. And then we have Representative Esme Cole. And Esme is brand new to the legislature, so if you have...
Bravo.
Yes.
Yes.
So if
New
you...
generation.
She's fallen into bad company.
I know, I know. So Esme, I'd love if you take a moment to introduce yourself
Sure.
and anything on this topic that you're thinking about tonight.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate everyone who took the time to make this a possibility and to have these conversations. I think part of what Dick spoke to is it can feel overwhelming. We are in it deep at the moment, and so I think the way this conversation is being framed as taking actionable steps together and combining forces with all the different skills that each of you bring to the table, I think that is our most likely route to success in sort of fighting this battle that we will unfortunately continue to have for many years to come. But it is important to stay optimistic. And I think in doing so, or in having these conversations, that is the only way to stay optimistic, because making concrete change. Yes, climate is obviously near and dear to my heart. I'm a lifelong resident of Hartford here. I am a new member of the Hartford Energy Commission as well. So that's a really interesting way I've been learning about the concrete ways that people in my community have been making wonderful efforts to make change, including, for example, right here I have this guide that some of our members made to make driving electric vehicles or purchasing them more accessible, like people understanding the benefits, and that are given to us by like government stipends and what's available. And they've done wonderful things such as the window dressers program as well to keep homes insulated and help low-income families save on heating costs, which is critical no matter where you fall on the income spectrum, of course. But it's just piece by piece, all these different concrete things that it's changing the sort of the way we perceive our relationship to the earth, which is why I also really appreciate the land acknowledgement we had here at the beginning, because it's so easy to fall into this consumerist, capitalist society, which is just consume, and it is so counterproductive to, I think, the way we are probably meant to live. So making us, yes, more aware as a community and thinking about what our real values are underneath it all is critical. And thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here and meet you all.
Yeah, thank you, Esme.
Yeah, thank you.
Since we're waiting on some other folks to ascend, I'll just make a note that the reason we wanted to do some of the introductions, and you'll have a moment to talk more to the legislators here, is because we want to make sure that you have a comfort with reaching out to them, reaching out to us. Because one of the most difficult things about being in the State House is you can feel a little separate from your community. You're up there for 4 nights out of the week, potentially. And when you have a constituent who reaches out, it's so much more powerful when you've had a conversation with them. You can read that name in the email or know the voice on the other end of the phone. So please take a moment, if you can, to make a concrete connection with the legislators here, or know that anyone on the screen is really engaged in this topic as well and would like to do good work on it. So thank you, Georgia, for
Thank you. Yes, and thank you both for being here. We can't wait to hear more during our advocacy breakout. But before we dig into that, we're going to try out a separate activity, and my colleague Jane, she is going to go around and distribute some note cards to you all. You should have some pens on your desk. For folks over here, let me know what you need. We have some clipboards if you need, something solid to write on. But as she is distributing those, I will give sort of the overview of what we're doing. Right now, I want you all to focus on the pink note card. What we'll be doing there is answering the question, what do you think is the most important issue for Vermont to tackle on climate? So think about that for a moment. It's okay if you don't have the perfect answer. It's okay if you have a few. Whatever comes to mind, write it down on that card, and you're going to pass it back up to me. The reason why we're doing this is because we are going to share your responses with your legislators so that they have a sense of what their constituents are looking to do and what they care most about. So take a moment to do that, and again, let me know if anyone is in need of any materials. And then once that's all done, I'll talk about the next two colored cards. But let's start with pink.
And more than one is okay?
More than one.
Yeah, more than one is okay.
Yeah, Linda. Share the energy committee back there.
And whenever you are done with your pink card, no rush, just pop a hand up and we'll come grab them from you. Oh, wow, that was quick.
Never gold star.
Love it.
But what did she write?
Oh my God.
Sustainable Woodstock strikes first.
Yes.
She was ready for that.
Yeah, I'm seeing folks from Sharon, Woodstock, Hartford, Norwich, Thetford.
Royalton.
We got Royalton,
Bradford.
Brownsville. Gosh, we got
Tunbridge.
Tunbridge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, cool.
Nice. Stratford. Okay, we got a mix.
Very cool.
You can't cheat off.
I know, I was just gonna
Yes, I
say.
can. That's why I always said, it's so smart drilling.
There you go. It's worked out for you so far.
Yeah, it's I've done real well.
We love our interactive. Oh, you can hold on to that for a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. You did all. Yeah, you can keep that for a bit. I can take the pink one from you. I think Tom, you're the collector.
I will do some questions.
And Jane is floating around, ready to collect your cards at any moment. Oh, so I hand over there. Should have put a name tag on. That's okay. It's too late.
Thank you.
So sweet.
Thank you for the email we sent you.
Of course.
I was wondering which room. It was very nice to know which room.
Yeah, I got here early so I could suss it out, so I could let you all know what to expect.
Oh, cool.
Because I also wasn't quite sure until I got here. All right, so as we are wrapping up those pink note cards, I will just share a few notes about the following two that we'll be working on. So as we go throughout this presentation, some questions might come to the surface, and that's what you're going to use your blue note card for. So those are questions that we can do during our Q&A later on that you may not want to forget. And once that point comes and we do that Q&A, you can either pass those cards up or you can just raise your hand and read them out loud, whatever you feel more comfortable with. So again, as we're going through the presentation, the blue note card is for any questions that you come up with. And then we will take care of the green note card at the end. That's when it all comes together and we're going to figure out what you each individually plan to do to advocate for climate in the coming year. So we will revisit that one later on, but that's what we've got planned. Does that all sound good to everybody?
Perfect.
Awesome. And we're all good on the pink cards. I think I see a few more. That's totally fine. Keep working on those. But if there are no other questions, I think we'll move forward. Thanks, everyone. All right. So I would like to take a few moments now to talk about climate impacts and exactly what we're looking at here in the state of Vermont. And if you're here tonight, you likely already have an idea of what's going on, but I do think it is really important to give some background context as to why we're so adamant about doing this kind of work. So right now we know that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's happening here at home. And it's likely that you have also noticed the following. Winters are getting warmer, summers are getting hotter, we're seeing a lot more flooding, and unfortunately also a lot more drought. There's species loss, algae blooms, heat waves, air quality warnings, tropical storms, ticks and Lyme disease, those are nasty, mental health crises, a mass migration, which creates a lot of opportunity here in the state, but also creates a housing crisis, making it difficult for folks to find a home. And of course, let's also not forget the fact that it was extremely hot this past fall. And a pretty helpful reminder as we're thinking about voting and elections and why climate is such an important issue. So that's what we've got going on. And of course, this isn't just based off of observation, it is backed up by science as well. And in 2021, the University of Vermont released the Vermont Climate Assessment, which has a lot of tons and tons of statistical details and data and information talking about why this is such an important issue. And I'm not going to get into the details of the climate assessment tonight, that would take far too long, but I do definitely encourage that you take a look at it, it's super helpful. But what I will do tonight is discuss some basic relevant findings that you would find in this assessment and in other assessments as well. Alright, so as I mentioned earlier, we know that winters are getting warmer, and average winter temperatures in Burlington have increased over 7 degrees on average since 1970. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of different things happening in our environment up here in Vermont. So we're noticing that there's a lot less snowfall, we're having shorter winter seasons, we're seeing a lot earlier ski mountain closures, earlier lake thaws, less ice, all of these things. And this, of course, impacts everything that we do to play outdoors during the winter time. It impacts skiing and snowshoeing and ice fishing and all of those fun things. And of course, here in Vermont, we do rely pretty heavily on the tourism industry and all of those fun things that we do outside during the winter. But of course, it doesn't just affect us, it also affects plant and animal life that surrounds us as well. So, something important to think about. And then alternatively, we see that summers are warming as well, over 3 degrees on average since 1970. And that may not sound like a lot, but it can really make a huge impact on our environment and in our space, again, on human life, animal life, and just environment in general. And I know personally I have felt the heat this past summer and this past fall, and I cannot imagine a Vermont where that continues to be the case. I moved up here because I like those cooler temperatures. So anyway, that's why we really need to work on this. And of course, driving back to those human health impacts, it's pretty serious. Extreme heat is one of them, that's why we're talking about it. But there's also lots of other ways that we are impacted by the changing climate. So we also have severe weather, air pollution, and increasing allergens, water quality impacts, water and food supply impacts. All of these things bringing into our environment make us more susceptible and more vulnerable. And of course, I need to mention the fact that while we are all affected by climate change, it's not quite equal. We know that low-income Vermonters, BIPOC community members, and youth are more disproportionately impacted by climate. But at the end of the day, we are all facing these things, and that's why we all have a stake in this game. We want to protect our health, and we want to protect our environment. So sometimes folks will ask me, or more so tell me, that climate change is a natural phenomena. And to that, I would just like to share that some degree of change, yes, is natural, and that's just the way it is. But science finds that time and time again, the vast majority of this what we're experiencing here today is directly derived from human impact. So as you'll see here on this graph, there are many graphs like this one, the sort of natural drivers, or we're seeing on that blue line that kind of just goes straight down. But this sort of increasing slope here, that's based off of human impact. impact. So the things that we are doing in our day-to-day, which are driving our emissions up. So just wanted to make a note of that because it is a question that comes up a lot. And so what do these human impacts look like here in the state of Vermont? So transportation, we'll start with that. It is the largest carbon emitter here in the state, accounting for 40% of all of our emissions. And that's pretty obvious. It's because Vermonters drive a lot, and a lot of the times we're driving long distances, and it's also useful for most of us in the state to sometimes use a truck, which also puts out a lot of emissions. So that one's fairly straightforward. And then closely following that, we have heating at 34% of the carbon emissions. And it's just because that's the way we heat our homes. We do have those cooler months still, luckily, and we need to heat our homes. So luckily the good news here is that we do have a plan to address these areas and these issues. And to be clear, we want to ensure that we're doing so in a way that is inclusive and accessible and affordable to all Vermonters. We want these cleaner alternatives to serve as a benefit to folks and not as a burden. So Senator White will talk more about that when she gets to the policy piece of things, but something I just wanted to note early on.
Thanks.
All right, and just for some visual context, we do have a lot of work to do. I think that's probably clear. If you didn't see this, you would still know we've got a lot to do. But this graph shows us where we are currently and where we need to be. And the reality is we need to significantly cut back on emissions in order to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. If you're not familiar with what that is, you will hear more about it soon. But basically what you need to know is there are certain milestones that we need to hit in order to reduce emissions and reach our goals overall. So again, just a visual representation of where our emissions currently are and where we need to bring them. All right, and just 2 more slides from me. I'm going to end on a super hopeful note. We've got lots of good news, okay? Vermonters care a whole lot about what's going on with climate and what's going on here in their state. And the vast majority of Vermonters are actually deeply alarmed about the climate crisis. And now just for reference, VPIRG did conduct a really large poll last December, nearly a year ago, just to better understand attitudes towards climate change. And in doing this, we utilized a framework called the Global Warming 6 Americas. Is anyone in the room familiar with that framework? A few? Okay, awesome, very cool, nice. It's totally okay if you haven't heard of this, and I'll explain it really briefly. Essentially, this framework utilizes a spectrum, and it places folks within that spectrum. And on one far side, you've got the alarmed subset. Those are the folks who are most engaged, who are the most concerned. They care a lot about climate change, and they want to get involved. And then on the far other side of that, you've got the dismissive folks who really don't want any part in it and will go as far as sort of endorsing conspiracy theories of climate change as a hoax and trying to get folks to go in the opposite direction. And then of course within that spectrum you have varying other locations, right? So that's what we utilized, and we found some really cool information. In a lot of cases it's sort of similar when we're comparing Vermont to the United States at large. But something that is particularly important is what we've got going on right here. The folks who are super alarmed completely almost double what we're currently seeing in the United States broadly. So that's telling us that folks are really passionate about what's going on and they want to find ways to get involved. So we're super thrilled with those results. And finally, I'll wrap with some really cool polling comparisons. And I'll start by just saying that this is not an apples to apples comparison. These are 2 separate pollsters. The questions were slightly different, so I'm putting that caveat out there right now. But I think overall the evidence is clear that we are moving in the right direction and folks are becoming more and more passionate about this work and wanting to get involved. So again, last December when we conducted this poll, we asked where Vermonters' concerns lied, and we found that climate change came in at number 6. And that's not to say that all of these other issues aren't important. They totally are. But this just goes to show that in a world of competing interests, it's hard to keep climate change top of mind. For so many people, it feels like a faraway thing, like, oh, we'll deal with it later. But the reality is we should have dealt with it many, many moons ago. So that's an important distinction to make. But again, in July of 2022, WCX released their polls, which showed some really, really good news, actually. And overall, among all voters, it came out to be that climate change was the number 2 most concerning issue, which is a huge jump. And among Democrats alone, it's the #1 most concerning issue. So anyway, we're thrilled with that, we're thrilled with this passion, and that's why we're here tonight. We're getting folks more involved and showing that we can do more to advocate for climate, and the polling shows us so. So anyways, with that, I will pass it over to Senator-elect White to talk about making local progress.
Thanks, Jordan.
Where do you want to start?
Swap spots.
Yeah, she's awesome.
You got to have the Hartford logo. That's a very proud moment.
This is a really nice podium. I was pleased to see that.
So Jordan set the tone for us tonight, which I think everyone in the room that I recognize, you're all steeped in this conversation already. You didn't need to be convinced on the fact that global warming is having a serious impact on our lives at present. So not only did we want to just set that baseline, potentially give you some quick marketing responses you could have if someone says, as Jordan pointed out at you, that climate change is not man-made, but is natural. You now have some tools, and we're going to talk about that more. What I'm going to describe to you is what we've done on the local and state level and the work that we're going to build on in this next legislative session. So if you've been following the news, you've probably heard of the Climate Action Plan. But how did we get here? So the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was passed in 2020, we can give a big thank you to many local reps for that, including Representative Tim Briglin, for example, who worked tirelessly on that in the Energy and Technology Committee. Thank you. He chose not to run for re-election this year and has Representative Rebecca Holcomb and Jim Maslin is continuing on. I know both Holcomb and Maslin are dedicated to this issue. So again, keep them in mind if you have questions or comments. So what we did is we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which gives a legal framework if Vermonters, for example, see that the goals that we put in place are not being met. And that gives some teeth to, rather than goals, we're actually creating expectations for what we need to do to respond to global warming. So out of that, we created the Climate Council. The Climate Council was an appointed organization of people from a lot of different backgrounds with the idea of creating a plan that we could look at as a state to point us in the right direction with some very clear steps. And that Climate Action Plan, or the CAP, if you've been circulating around Montpelier, is a thick document that lays out a host of different strategies that respond to what we need to do for carbon emissions reduction in particular. We additionally have seen things from the Joint Fiscal Office, and the Energy Action Network has also put out their yearly report that showed the financial benefits in addition to the emission reduction benefits we could see from moving forward with pieces of the Climate Action Plan. If you're running into Vermonters who are concerned about increased costs like inflation that's happening right now, I highly recommend using that as an opportunity to talk about the increased costs and lost opportunity for savings that we have if we don't respond to the concerns we have with climate change in the short term, not just the long term. There were some successful pieces of legislation last year, and a lot of work went into something called the Environmental Justice Bill, and we were joined by Representative Coach Christie, who's one of the Hartford reps, and also chairs the Social Equity Caucus. And I know that that group did a lot of work on moving the Environmental Justice Bill. We were one of a few states that didn't have an environmental justice policy, which looks at how we can have a framework for supporting vulnerable Vermonters, people of color in our communities, and folks who have traditionally been marginalized in our systems. So we also saw a whole host of other positives this last legislative session, although there were some, if you saw that last slide, you know anything about the clean heat standard, we'll talk about that more. One piece I wanted to highlight that may have flown under the radar for you is the Transportation Innovation Act, which was a bill that was worked on in House and in part Senate Transportation that created a new way of working with the Agency of Transportation to mobilize them to use federal dollars to support electric vehicles, public transportation, something called microtransit, if anyone wants to learn more about that. e-bikes, and other bike and pedestrian forms of travel. So next up, I've got a special treat for you, which is a video. So this video is very brief, but I think it gives us a nice highlight of some of the work done, and it has a joke in it. So I love I laughed out loud the first time I saw this joke. So well done. So now I've hyped it up.
Vermont state fish, the brook trout, can only survive in cool, clean water. Much like the brook trout, Vermonters rely on a clean, healthy environment, but unlike the brook trout, Vermonters can vote. In the 2022 election, Vermont voters made their voices heard, electing strong majorities of pro-climate candidates across the state. Vermonters love the great outdoors, but climate change threatens so much about what makes our state special. The environmental community knows that we need leaders who will take strong action on climate. It takes collaboration, coordination, and commitment, which is why together, Vermont conservation voters and Deep Heard Votes work hard to support pro-environment candidates and educate voters on where their leaders stand on the climate crisis. This election season, we went all out. Recruiting and training candidates, hosting forums and debates, financially supporting candidates, hitting the phones, radio, and digital media, and knocking on doors like never before. Now, it's time to get to work on building a just, equitable future for every Vermonter. We can bring hundreds of millions of dollars of federal investments into Vermont to benefit our families and businesses. We can put thousands of Vermonters to work, build renewable energy, weatherize our homes, and modernize our electric grid, improve the way we get around, and support communities most impacted by climate change. So, to protect those who voted and those who can't, now is the time to act.
Okay.
You were right.
Thank you. It was funny.
Yeah, it was funny.
A funny joke. It was really funny. And we even had a cameo by Celebrity Jane over here. And I'll say the reason that I'm really proud of the work that happened. Do you want to see it again? No.
It wasn't that funny.
Thanks, Bob.
I think my one and only problem with that joke, and I mean this sincerely, is
Yes, no.
it might have almost been too hilarious.
And you're saying, thank you. Well, one of the things I wanted to highlight coming out of that video is that we haven't seen a climate change motivated electorate like we did in the midterm. So that is extremely important information for us to take as voters, because at times I'll hear from other elected officials, you know, I don't really want to talk about that issue, or it's a lower down issue for me, for my voters. But what I want to communicate to you tonight is that that's actually not true. That what we saw in elections where there was a climate champ against someone who was either an active denier that climate change was happening, or felt that, or ran on a policy that was anti-carbon tax, which, depending on how you feel about it, is not something that is on the docket. We found that those candidates were less successful time and time again. So we had historic turnout. Over 52% of Vermonters voted in the midterm election. That's incredible information. Go Vermont. We also had some important races that were decided on topics like climate change. If you're in the Orange County area, you know Carl Demrow. Representative Demrow won on a pro-climate statement. We had Representative Catherine Sims, who beat out an incumbent. She is also an incumbent, but they were put in a district together in the Northeast Kingdom, showing that in the Northeast Kingdom we can win on climate change. And we also had Senator Mark McDonald, who ran against John Clark. So, I mean, that is going to set us up for success this legislative session in a way that we haven't had in the past with climate champions. And what's so exciting is the Climate Solutions Caucus, which I have the privilege of co-chairing from the Senate side. We're going to see us having a better ability to advocate for these policies to be top of mind to our leadership both in the House and the Senate. So thank you for voting, and it really does show how impactful that can be, and those numbers are going to bear out when we have to go against things like vetoes from the governor, who has almost exclusively vetoed climate-related legislation that's come to his desk. So what are we going to be working on this upcoming session, and what have we seen in the past? So advanced clean cars and the trucks rule, that was actually passed through rulemaking, something called LCAR. So go LCAR if you know what that terminology means. But it moves us forward on our carbon emission goals, and it's tied to the California standards that they have for vehicles. So we saw that through rulemaking, although it does require some work on behalf of the legislature in the future. We also have the clean heat standard, which I want to spend a bit of time on. So last year, the clean heat standard, which you'll now know, do you see that word affordable? We're popping it in this year. So the clean heat standard of yore lost by one single vote for a veto override in the House, which was an exceptionally difficult day for anyone who had worked on that policy. So we're going to come back and reintroduce a clean heat standard bill. We will most likely start it on the Senate side, is where the conversation is now. And the clean heat standard, who's familiar with the clean heat standard? If you could raise your hand. Okay, folks, we're doing it again. And
The one the governor vetoed.
Exactly, you got it. So we're working to reintroduce that piece of legislation. But one of the key changes that we've identified is focusing on low and moderate income Vermonters and pulling that into the conversation in a deeper way. The last bill I wanted to mention, you've heard about the renewable energy standard in the past, circa 2015. It's now time for us to re-engage the conversation around net metering, solar, wind, all of the different ways that we can support a cleaner grid. We need to have conversations about it this upcoming legislative session. It's going to be something that we need to move quickly. It's also going to impact our access to federal funds. We're leaving money on the table by not having an updated renewable energy standard. So this means that we want to have a really clean grid, we want to have a really clean transportation system, and we also want to move our thermal sector away from carbon emitting fossil fuels. I wanted to take a moment just to talk about social equity and how that fits into the framework of legislation we're doing. When I think about the environmental movement, one of the most difficult chapters of the environmental movement is how white supremacy dominated the way that we thought about the environmental movement, where wealthy white people had the most access to the outdoors, had the most access to clean water, clean air. And that's a wrong that we need to correct, not only in what we say, but in the types of policies that we pass. So the Environmental Justice Bill is a great first step, but I know that the Climate Solutions Caucus, in particular, we've spent time working on a screening process for our bills. Because you might have a great idea, but if you don't have someone in the room that represents a different life experience, you might not be able to adequately meet the needs of every Vermonter. And that also includes vulnerable income groups. If you're someone who has thought about purchasing an electric vehicle, your income is probably the #1 thing you're thinking about when you're making that decision. So to make sure that we have income and any other marginalized groups a part of the conversation is going to be critical for passing any piece of legislation that we do this next session. So we've come to the time where you get to talk to each other. So our next step is the advocacy breakout. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and we are going to break out, and Jordan is going to tell us a bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So what we would like to do now is have our legislators somewhat separate throughout the room if possible. And essentially we want to break up into smaller groups. So all of the attendees here, you're going to pick perhaps the legislator that's closest to you, keep it really simple. They all have the same questions, so you're not going to miss anything depending on who you pick. So we'll just try to keep it relatively even, and you'll get to have some good conversation for the next 10 minutes or so. You'll get to learn a little bit more about the legislators and the types of things that they're working on. You'll also get to ask questions and get to discover the different ways that you can advocate for climate. So this should be a really good way to connect with the people in your community and give you some good tips along the way.
And we'll do this for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll have more of an open Q&A. If there's things that have popped up during the presentation or that come out of your conversations, we'll have a moment to talk about them. So Esme, would you mind being our person in the corner over there? Maybe snag that seat. And Dick or Coach, do you have a location in the room that you prefer? Maybe you want to maybe do the center of the room, you could be right there?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then Coach, do you want to stay right there? Cool, so we got Esme to my left, Dick McCormick in the middle, and Representative Coach Christie over here, and then I'll go, oh, I didn't even think about myself. I'll go back towards Linda. So you got it.
So feel free